Welcome, everyone. My name is Jordana Mendelson, and I'm the director of the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel today on food and the Hispanic world across time and space. This panel is the first in several programs and events organized in celebration of the 25th anniversary of the KJCC. Over its 25 years, the KJCC has held as its primary mission to organize academic, cultural, and public outreach activities in relation to Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. This year, we recognize that history and also open up our conversations to reframe, interrogate, and dialogue with different understandings about Spain and its relation to Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa. A second panel, organized for fall 2022, will focus on decolonizing global geographies. We thank our co-sponsors of today's panel, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Center for the Humanities, the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies, and the Latinx Project. Our speakers for today's panels join us from across the globe, from 5 different time zones, from New Orleans to Melbourne. We invite you to join us by putting your questions and comments in the chat box on Facebook Live. If you are not logged into Facebook and would like to send in a question or comment, you can do that at kjcc.info@nyu.edu, and that address will be put in the Facebook chat for you to see as well. It is my privilege to introduce our moderator, who will in turn present our speakers and lead us in a conversation about food in the global Hispanophone. Rosi holds a chair in Hispanic Studies at Durham University. A specialist in 20th and 21st century Spanish culture and literature, she is the author of Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain, and the co-editor of Traces of Contamination, Unearthing Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Discourse, and Towards a Cultural Archive of La Movida. She is one of the series editors for Culinaria, a new book series from the University of Toronto Press on food studies, and serves on the editorial board for the Toronto Iberic series, and recently joined the editorial collective of the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies. Her most recent book, co-written with Ana Riera, is A Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating. I will be disappearing from the program, and I pass the whole program now over to Rosi Song. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordana. Thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. Before I get started introducing our presenters today, let me quickly start us with this roundtable. So food is something that can unite but also divide us. We develop taste and attachment to ingredients, dishes, traditions, depending on where, when, and how we grew up, with whom we shared our meals, who cooked for us, or for whom we actually prepared our meals. So to think about food in the global Hispanophone world means to think about food across a wide geography, a long historical period, contact between people from different races, products from different fauna and flora, and above all, movement. So we gather our presenters today to think about some of these questions, and we'll go around them after I introduce each one of them and start them with some questions and lead us into discussion. So let me introduce our first participant, Lara Anderson. Lara is Associate Professor in the Spanish and Latin American Studies program at the University of Melbourne. Her main research area is Spanish food culture, and her most recent monograph, Control and Resistance, Food Discourse in Franco Spain with University of Toronto Press, looks at how food discourse as both a site of control and resistance during the first 2 decades of the Franco regime. She has published extensively on many aspects of Spanish food discourse, such as culinary nationalism, food and politics, and food and gender in leading international journals. She has also co-edited a journal issue entitled Trans-Hispanic Food Cultural Studies, which delineates the emerging field of Hispanic cultural food studies, inserting Hispanic voices into the arena of food studies and making food central to a praxis of cultural studies in the trans-Hispanic world. She also writes about Australian food culture, in particular food multiculturalism, culinary xenophobia, and refugee and migrant food initiatives. She has written too about Latin American food culture in the context of Australian food multiculturalism. Our next participant is Rebecca Earle. She's a historian of food. Many of us know her work. She recently completed a ridiculously, her words, not mine, extended project on the global history of the potato, which considers both the processes that led to the Andean potato becoming a major global foodstuff, and also the historical origins of the concept of food sovereign security. And it's a very good book. I recommend it. Before potatoes, or as she calls it, BP, she worked on food's role in shaping colonial Spanish American culture, the use of the indigenous past in the construction of nationalist narratives in post-colonial Spanish America, and the wars of independence in early 19th century Spanish America. She's also written about the intersections between clothing and identity, early modern travel, love letters, and other topics. Her next research project was going to explore what we learn or what we can learn from recipes other than how to cook, but she's been diverted into tracing the history of some unusual Mexican casta paintings that made their way to the UK in the 18th century. Finally, our last presenter is Melissa Fuster. Her research examines the contextual factors influencing food practices and the policies and interventions implemented to improve them. This work applies a multidisciplinary and intersectional approach to examine underlying social determinants of diet-related health inequities, with a focus on Latin American communities and its diaspora communities. Her community-based research experience has sought to address diet-related disparities, aiming to shift emphasis to upstream approaches that engage the structural factors that underlie access to healthy food and high-quality healthcare. This was the subject of her first book, Caribeños at the Table: How Migration, Health, and Race Intersect in New York City. And building on this work, Dr. Fuster is currently tackling food access issues via the Latin American Restaurants in Action, LARIA, project, supported by an NIH NHLBI Career Development Award. So the LARIA project applies systems, science, design thinking, and implementation sciences to engage Latin restaurants in designing and implementing innovations to facilitate healthier eating. She completed her PhD in food policy and applied nutrition at the Tufts University. And before joining the faculty at Tulane University, she was assistant professor at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. Thank you, everyone. Welcome today to this table. So let's get us started. We have so many questions. So let me perhaps ask Rebecca to get us started. As a historian, can you start talking about food and movement? What would you say is the impact of movement in terms of exploration, travel, migration, diaspora in food practices? And in what ways do you think food changes or in a way stays the same?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. And I also want to say thank you very much to the organizers, to the Juan Carlos Center for laying on what I hope will be a really enjoyable event. But to try to answer your question a bit, the way that we eat is profoundly shaped by movement, by the movement of people, by the movement of plants and animals, and by the movement of ideas. So let me try to say a little bit about each of those things. So maybe start perhaps by talking about the movement of people. And our diets have long been shaped by the movements of people. Food travels because people travel. And perhaps one of the most consequential travels for the history of food was Christopher Columbus's inadvertent arrival in the Caribbean in 1492. And as we probably all know, this encounter with an unfamiliar continent and with unfamiliar people was a considerable surprise to Europeans. And among the things that surprised them were the vast variety of, to them, unfamiliar foodstuffs that they encountered in the Americas: tomatoes and potatoes and cacao and maize and sweet potatoes and pineapples and vanilla and chili peppers and peanuts. It was a culinary counter and as well as being a colonial encounter. And in a way, if you think about it, you could perhaps think that two sorts of scenes really characterized those encounters between Europeans and indigenous people in the 16th century, either a battle or a shared meal. When indigenous people and Iberians weren't trying to kill each other, they often shared a meal. Hungry Spaniards were absolutely desperate for food, and indigenous people were often very curious about the peculiar foodstuffs that were being consumed by these unwelcomed and unexpected arrivals. And Spanish chronicles are full of descriptions of these food exchanges, and Columbus himself records in his journal that on landing in one of the Caribbean islands, he offered the local ruler what he called Castilian food. And he notes that the king ate one mouthful and gave the rest to his entourage. He wasn't particularly interested in tasting it further. There's another account from the 16th century, for example, in which an Italian traveler in Venezuela describes how the Spaniards offered some of their food to an indigenous group. And he records that, as he put it, laughing at such food, they threw it to their dogs. So we have a range of different reactions on the part of indigenous people to European food, but this sort of unequivocal hostility doesn't typify all dimensions of what historians tend to call the Columbian exchange, the global dissemination of foods that followed in the wake of Columbus's arrival in the Americas and the subsequent European invasion. And over the next centuries, food from the Americas spread all over the world, so that by the early 17th century, Caribbean and coastal, they're from the Caribbean and from the Atlantic coast of South America, pineapples had reached India, for example, and peanuts and potatoes and maize were being grown in China, again by the early 17th century. And in the same years, people in Madrid were learning to spice up their foods using a chili pepper rather than expensive imported black pepper. So for example, writing in the 1590s, the Jesuit chronicler Jose de Acosta wrote about foods from the Americas, but when he got to the chili pepper, and here in the slide, I think you can see a painting by Velázquez that shows, you can just, I hope, see the chili peppers appearing on this table of this very humble meal in this wonderful painting by Velázquez. Acosta, when he came to chili peppers, didn't feel he needed to explain what they were at all to his Spanish readers. And he simply wrote, well, it's a well-known thing. I don't need to say anything more about it. So, by 1590, it was a well-known thing. And of course, at the same time, indigenous peoples across the Americas were adding new foods to their own diets, from lettuce to pork. And of course, over time, the complex blendings that resulted from these different culinary systems coming together form the basis of what today we often think of as Mexican or Colombian or Argentine food. Oh, there's a wonderful picture of a turkey from a German cookery book from the mid 16th century, which I thought you might enjoy just because it's such a charming picture. So all of these foods blended together to create what we think of, I think, as the national cuisines of many parts of Latin America. Because in virtually all of Latin America, the dishes that are considered particularly typical usually reflect blendings of ingredients from different parts of the world that resulted from the Columbian exchange. So whether it's an Argentine bife de chorizo with Malbec and some chips, some fries, or whether it's an enchilada suiza or a Brazilian moqueca, whose very name comes from an Angolan language, those dishes are the result of the hybridization that followed in the wake of the movement of peoples that traveled across the globe as a result of the Columbian exchange. And these foods moved, just to stress this, because people were moving all over the world. It was Portuguese sailors who brought those pineapples to the Mughal court in India, and the peanuts to India, to China, for example. And it was enslaved West Africans who brought the palm oil and the rice and the expertise on how to grow them, one should remember, that go into dishes like a moqueca, etc. So many of these staples, and Europeans were also bringing their foods to the Americas as they traveled. So it was people who were moving and who were bringing these foods with them. It was Europeans then who took those chili peppers back to India, where women started adding them to chorizo to make the spicy dishes that we, the distinctive flavors that we are familiar with today. So food were traveling because people were traveling. But sometimes it's the plants that move and that prompt the movement of people rather than people moving and then bringing the plants with them. We might think that we're the only ones who have agency. We might think that we're the ones who move around and we bring our plants, but sometimes the plants cause people to move. And the most devastating example of that, I think, is sugar, which isn't native to the Americas at all, but was introduced by Columbus in the 1490s. And the movement of sugarcane to the Caribbean was directly responsible for the enslavement of the movement, I guess, as well as the enslavement, if we're thinking about movement, the movement of millions of people from the west coast of Africa, the vast majority of whom were taken to the Americas in order to labor in the sugar plantations that devoured the lives of millions of men and women. And sugar, as people said at the time, is made of blood. Because, and this, I think, points out to one of the other aspects of colonialism, which is that it involved the deliberate introduction of new plants into European colonies with the specific purpose of growing them as commercial commodities. So Europeans for sure were bringing pigs and lettuces and radishes to the Americas when they arrived in the colonial period. Some of those were brought for their own purposes and to consume themselves, but they were also, and much more importantly, well, what's more important, equally importantly and very consequentially for the lives of millions of other people, bringing these plants that they wanted to grow specifically as commercial commodities. So things like sugar, as I've already mentioned, I think on the slide you can see some of these things that were brought, coffee, tea, bananas, cacao, all of these different foods were deliberately moved into European colonial spaces, such as the Americas, with the view of growing them for profit as a commercial crop. Bananas are not originally from the Caribbean. They were brought there. Cacao is not, which is now widely grown in West Africa as a New World food. It was not native to West Africa. And the presence of these foodstuffs in these parts of the world is the result of deliberate efforts to create plantation economies. So you can see this is a very global process. And in all these cases, the idea was to grow these foods using unfree labor, whether it was enslaved labor or indentured servants or convicts. Europeans introduced commercial agriculture grown with unfree labor into every zone that they colonized. So the movement of foods around the people prompted the vast movement of people subsequently, the laborers who were there growing these foods. And as these people traveled, dragged along by the movements of these foodstuffs that were going to be grown commercially, they of course brought with them their foods. And the food historian Michael W. Twitty expressed this really well, talking about West Africans going to the Americas. And he said, with them traveled an entire 70,000 years of eating and cooking. So with the people who were taken from West Africa, pulled by the sugar, in a sense, pulled by the process of enslavement, but pulled by the desire of others to grow sugar, came their culinary culture as well. And do I have, Rosie, do I have time to say a little bit about ideas? Should I? Yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
I'll say a little bit in that case about also how the movement of ideas also shapes how we eat. And I want to say just something very briefly, so I don't talk for too long. But I want to say a little bit as an example about our ideas about health and nutrition. So let me give you an example. From the late 19th century, new scientific ideas began to emerge that tried to explain how food nourishes our body. And it tried to do that using ideas really derived from chemistry. And this is the origin of our idea about the calorie, for example, or about vitamins and proteins. This way of thinking about food is made up of these chemical constituents so that we can analyze using numbers and that we can explain a food by saying it has so many calories, it has this much protein, it has this much fat, etc. These ideas emerged as a very powerful scientific language that spread all around the world from the second half of the 19th century. And so it shaped thinking about food in many parts of the world. In India, for example, scientists tried to grapple with how to marry up long-standing Ayurvedic ideas about what constituted healthy food with these new dietary guidelines, with these new ideas about food and health. And the same thing happened in the Americas, also in Spain as well, for that matter. But just to think about a little bit about the Americas, politicians in Colombia or in Mexico, for example, by the early 20th century, were designing new programs that were aimed very explicitly at trying to reshape the eating habits of the populations in line with this new scientific thinking about what constituted healthy food. So politicians in 20th century Mexico, for example, tried to persuade the population to eat more wheat in place of maize, citing what was for them up to the minute, we might say very mistaken, but was for them, cutting edge science about what was most nutritious. So the movement of ideas can also shape how we eat. So let me try to bring this together a little bit. And I mean, I guess what am I trying to say? That how we eat is profoundly shaped by movement, by the movement of peoples, by the movement of plants, by the movement of ideas. And I think this is expressed really nicely. The long-standing heritage. Oh yeah, there's an example of a workers' canteen where it was an opportunity to try to reshape eating habits through public health and public food consumption practices. But the whole this connection between the movement of peoples and today's world and the movement of food was really beautifully captured, I think, by the British Sri Lankan novelist Ambalavana Sivanandran, who expressed clearly how the location of people today reflects this history of colonial movement. And he said, we're here because you were there, talking about the presence of people from, in his case, he was thinking about the British former empire. But we could say the same thing about food. We could say that we eat the things that we eat. Those foods are here today because we, in the broadest sense, were there. The food is here because we were there. Foods traveled because we were there and because everybody moved around. So maybe that's enough on movement. I will be quiet.
Yes, thank you. And thank you. And also from movement to nutrition. And I think this provides a perfect segue actually to Melissa's work. And Melissa, before I let you talk about your research and about nutrition and health and food, I wanted to also give you a prompt about politics, right? We often hear this phrase, food is politics or food is political. In what ways do you think this is correct? Or given your research, what should we understand when we say that food is connected to politics? I think other words that are becoming increasingly connected with food are justice, activism, sustainability, food sovereignty, and so on. So can you tell us more about that?
Yes, thank you. And before I do want to, of course, thank the organizers and everybody here for joining today. It's just hearing Rebecca really set a beautiful stage for the conversation. So thank you. And yes, food is definitely political. And I see this relationship because as has been said before, food is so intertwined to who we are, our sense of identity, and politics, how we view the other special interests, all of the things that encompass the political aspects of life, of food, are also intertwined with all of that. In my work specifically, I have explored this from different angles. For example, even beyond the work in Caribeños at the Table, I have examined, for example, how socio-political contexts influence nutrition policy documents back to the movement of ideas. And I've done this, for example, comparing the dietary guidelines in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, where thanks to all the movement that has happened that brought to light what Caribbean diets are, we are so close in what we see our foods are, yet our political situations, economic situations are so different that it allows to really see that social political influence in discourse, in again, dietary guidelines, all of that, and in the work, of course, in Caribeños at the Table. And then I've also explored in other pieces, for example, how politics influence whether governments regulate what we eat or not, how much attention is paid for safety nets for the poor, how we feed our poor, how much food we give them, do we give them money, do we give them food, do we trust people to use the money we give them to consume the right food, whatever we deem that to be. So definitely politics is all embedded in there. And this work is of course influenced by the scholarship of others. Specifically, if you want, for the audience, if you want to read more about this, I definitely would recommend the work of Marion Nestle, and her book, of course, Food Politics, is amazing and really going deep in all of these issues. But more pertinent to this conversation, and moving more to the context of Latin America and again the Caribbean, the political aspects of foods are again very closely intertwined with everything that Rebecca just mentioned about how food move, how for example sugar is a big one in forming Caribbean societies, and all of that again was driven by special interests, slavery, all of those things that really form our identity and who we are. And this interplay between food movement and the political forces are really at the point of the book Caribeños at the Table, where I took a deep dive, borrowing from history, social sciences, and bringing it back to my home discipline of public health nutrition to examine how these global political forces are drivers of migration. Again, we keep moving all the time. And the creation of the foodways, not only in the Caribbean, but also in our diaspora communities in the United States. And I feel that this approach allowed me to better understand why it is that we see the persisting health inequities, especially when we look differences within Latino communities. And as a Puerto Rican, I'm also very sad to see that unfortunately my community tends to usually fare worse with things around diabetes, obesity, depression. And in the book, I tie this to our political situation, that we have been a colony of the United States for so long that even though we are US citizens, and technically this should provide us better access to livelihoods, healthcare, all of those things, just looking at the health outcomes, arguably that is not the case. So it's a very complicated story, and food, of course, for nutrition is a very important part of that story. And aside from, of course, talking about that in the US context, I also wanted to bring that the influence of the movement and power and politics in how the foodways in the Caribbean have been changing. So again, what Rebecca mentioned, all of the Spanish colonization, slavery, it was really a base of what we feel traditional diets are. And it's interesting that things that we think are inherent to our diets, like rice, pork, even the fish, bacalao, codfish, are not native to anywhere near the Caribbean, and yet they're so important to our sense of identity. And now if we pull this to the present, we see, of course, that the Spanish influence has been replaced by the United States as the superpower closer to us in the Caribbean, not only in Puerto Rico, because of course, yes, Puerto Rico does have that easy access to US goods and all of that, but also to what's going on in the foodways in Cuba with the embargo that has really affected what people have access to. And also Dominican Republic and elsewhere in Latin America. Again, the US has this important influence, not only through exports, but also again through the movement of ideas, what is good to eat, what are modern foods. And in Puerto Rico specifically, we see that, since the 1950s, Puerto Rico has served as a laboratory, for example, for fast foods coming into the island before many other places in Latin America. Again, that easy access to our economy. And also we have seen, unfortunately, decimation of agriculture, where most of the food, I think people usually throw around 80% of the food we consume is imported. Of course, that can be more, it can be less, but still it is a big deal. We are an import dependent country, or, I mean, of course we can argue about that label as well. But at the same time, I also wanted to also bring about that food, I feel, has also been serving as a vehicle for political resistance, and in many ways a reassertion of identity. I see that for more than a decade, we have seen a resurgence in agriculture. Younger generations are going back to the land, and in that way, sometimes even making a political statement about what that means. And even, people have becoming more aware of the influence of colonialism in what we eat in the land. A lot of our productive land is unfortunately taken by big companies, not fully accessible to people. So there is that going on. And interestingly, we are also seeing grassroots movements that are also, of course, have food at the center, as in the case, for example, of comedores sociales, community kitchens, that they have been popping up. For example, when we had Hurricane Maria, that the government wasn't really doing much, and you saw those grassroots movements feeding people. Of course, internationally, we saw Jose Andres. It was of course very important, but there was a lot of local people helping each other. And we see that, for example, in protests, other things that have happened, that food continues to be that vehicle to join people. And interestingly, back to my nutrition interest, I've also seen how these movements, again, making that political statement, reassertion of identity, are also bringing about a reminder of fruits, vegetables we may have forgotten to, and hopefully potentially resulting in healthier eating. Even though, of course, it's not, unfortunately, spread across the island at the moment, and the government can, of course, do more to support these movements. That's there's another conversation as to why this is not the case, but again, it's really encouraging to see, especially the young people trying to assert their identity. And again, food is a huge part of that.
Thank you, Melissa. And also thinking about sort of that movement, that activism, and how intrinsically related it is, right, to everyday life and the way we connect with our society, right? Yes. But perhaps also we can say that among us here at this virtual roundtable, right, that we work on food from an academic perspective, right, and need to actually pay attention to the difference between material and discourse, right? So Lara, what's your experience on food and writing and reading, right, about food? Why is it important, do you think, to pay attention to the discourses around food? And I know you just wrote a book about it, so I thought that I would ask you that question.
Thanks so much for that, Rosie. And firstly, for Jordana, for organising the panel discussion. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you in the audience and to be speaking with Melissa and Rebecca. So firstly, before speaking about food as discourse, I just thought I'd quickly mention that, like what Melissa was saying about control and resistance, my research is political, and inherently political as food discourse functions to either uphold or resist centralist, authoritarian, which was the focus of my most recent book, or subnationalist political projects. As I've discussed in relation to both of Spain's dictators, so Primo de Rivera and Franco, food discourse can be seen as a functions as a potent biopolitical tool And as part of the Franco biopolitics, individuals were managed and submitted to strict discipline and appropriate behaviour as the state promoted a stoic, patriotic, ultra-nationalist gendered body. Official discourse and food media, so representations of food in cultural texts like films, menus, descriptions of food and literature, newspapers with food descriptions, converged to control the citizenry's behaviour and thinking about Spanish food and identity. Food discourse produced ways of eating and thinking about food that privileged patriotism and health over personal desire, and encouraged citizens to make sacrifices and eat for the good of the nation. So that's the food as politics. And then food discourse. So my first book on food, Spanish food culture, also looked at food discourse. It was food discourse and as it related to the nationalization of Spanish cuisine in the late 19th century. I'll give some examples from that research, and then later on, when I talk about oranges, I'll go back to the Franco research. So my research is focused primarily on food discourse, and I've looked at the way menus, cookbooks, gastronomic texts, food sections in newspapers, and descriptions of food in television, literature, and official documents tell us what to eat and how to think about food. Importantly, this discourse also has an impact on subject formation. In writing about food, there is a need to differentiate between food as material object and food as discourse. If the food we ingest sustains us both physically and emotionally, then equally important is food discourse, which doesn't just describe food, but is also inherently political and instructs us in the uptake of our multiple and often competing identities. Material object versus discourse. One scholar to differentiate between food as object and food as discourse is Sidney Mintz, who reminds us of those national cuisines brought into being by the political reality of the central state, not necessarily reflective of the national diet. In contrast to regional cuisines, which are eaten daily, Mintz believes that it only makes sense to talk of a national cuisine when we have in mind the contents of a book, a restaurant, or some notion on contradiction to another. In response to these claims about national cuisine as little more than textual artifice, Parkhurst Ferguson underscores just how influential this textually driven culinary discourse has been in forming views nationally and internationally about what it means to be French. My research also argues for the importance of texts or discourse to the construction of a national cuisine in Spain from the 19th century onward, and several scholars have demonstrated the existence of textually reliant cuisine in countries such as Mexico, India, Denmark, and Italy. And this can be seen as evidence of transnational connections between different nations and ideas about national cuisines, because the circulation of ideas in texts and cookery books and people reading and coming to see what a national cuisine looked like in discourse. Spanish culinary nationalism and discourse. So indeed, when in the late 19th century, Spanish intellectuals began to think about the contours of a Spanish national cuisine in the context of nation building, as well as insisting on the importance of freeing their cuisine from the hegemony of neighbouring France's cuisine, they highlighted the importance or centrality of discourse to any culinary nationalist projects. At the same time as making suggestions about food as material object, in making the unorthodox suggestion that the then king would serve la olla podrida, rotten pot, at his birthday banquet, Dr. Thebson and the king's chef concluded that for Spain to have a recognisable national cuisine, a book would need to be written containing recipes from the diverse regions. This would solidify the idea of a regionally diverse national food culture while helping Spain's citizenry to know more about foodstuffs and recipes from across the country. Dr. Thebson reiterated the importance of culinary multiplicity to Spanish culinary nationalisation. And then some 40 years later, writing his guide at the request of a centralising dictatorship, Primo de Rivera, Ignacio Perez's choice of pen name, post-Thebson, in dedication to Dr. Thebson, make clear the genealogy of his thinking on Spanish cuisine. His text, Guía del Buen Comer Español, has remained influential amongst Spanish food writers and cookery book authors for its showcasing of regional cuisines in the context of nation building and reinforcing the idea that discourse would be central to the codification or that Spanish national culinary nationalisation would be textually reliant. And gastronomic authors and cookery book writers would cite his book for about 40 or 50 years after its publication, and once again going back to this idea of Spanish cuisine as being reliant on discourse and also being made up of regional cuisines. Sorry, allergies here. Spanish gastronomy and discourse. It is interesting to note that the concept of food as discourse has been at the heart of Spanish gastronomy since its origins in the late 19th century. In the absence of a Spanish national cuisine at the time of a lackluster nation building, Spain's pioneering gastronomers insisted on the textual codification of Spanish culinary traditions. This discourse has also been gendered, as I have shown elsewhere, a book, with mainly men taking up positions of authority and setting the boundaries of Spanish gastronomy, which has been closely linked to national culture. And it's really interesting to note that in the late 19th century, Amelia Pardewathan, who was the only female canonical author of the time and a realist writer who, like her male counterparts, was seen as creating a national novel, and she was always very determined to distance herself from her sex in those kind of literary undertakings. It's interesting to note that she doesn't write gastronomy at the same time as Dr. Thebson or just before Ignacio Perez was writing gastronomic texts. She writes cookery books and then talks about Spanish culinary traditions or this reliance on French cuisine and needing to break free of the French influence. She writes about that in prologues to cookery books and not in gastronomic texts, which is very interesting because everything else was distanced from her sex. So this idea that men were writing gastronomic texts seems to have had a big impact on subsequent writers, even ones like her. So that's me for now for Spanish.
Thank you.
Discourse.
Yeah. Thank you, Lara. So actually, we've gone through movement to health and politics and sort of discourse, like thinking about a national cuisine. So let's bring back the conversation to actually what brought us here together, which is actually food. So thinking about food and the Hispanophone world. So there seems to be food stuff or foods that seem to be very closely linked to its culture, right? Such as we already mentioned the potato, the orange, peppers, corn, rice, etc. So I'd like to invite you to talk about your food stuff, right? So Rebecca, can you talk to us a little bit about the potato, Melissa about the plantain, and Lara about oranges? So I'm just gonna let you go, whoever wants to start, perhaps Rebecca, and then we can go with Lara and finish with Melissa on these foods.
Well, thank you very much. I warn you, getting me started on the topic of potatoes is a risky undertaking.
Maybe I should have left you to the last.
I'll sort of restrain my enthusiasm. So what can one say about potatoes from this point of view? So potatoes are a really good illustration of how the movement of foods maps out the movements of peoples, because potatoes, as you probably all know, are native to the Andes. Well, actually, not just to the Andes, but to that whole spine of mountains that runs from from Chile all the way up through the Rockies, actually. And they found traces of wild potatoes in Utah going back to prehistoric times. So potatoes were grown all along this rocky mountainous spine that forms the backbone of the Americas. But that being their homeland, their cradle area, as biologists wonderfully describe it in this wonderfully gendered language of where plants originate. The Andes may be the potato's cradle area, but its adulthood is all over the world. And I think it points to the fact that fixating on origins isn't necessarily the most helpful way to understand anything about the modern world. It's really interesting, but it doesn't tell you about who we are now. So telling somebody in Spain that the Spanish omelet is based on an Andean potato is on the one hand really interesting, and it tells you something about the historical emergence of that particular dish. And you can think about its iconic status in Spain right now as one of, I bow to Lara on this, but I would say that the Spanish omelet is one of the few dishes that's probably truly absolutely national that people all over the country would eat. Well, she might have an opinion on that, but my point is that the fact that the potato came from elsewhere doesn't undermine the capacity of that dish to be profoundly Spanish. And I think that tells us something about the way in which foods, and actually perhaps also people, when they travel, take on new identities and become new things. And origin isn't destiny, in a sense. For foods in terms of what they mean, and foods take on all sorts of different meanings in new contexts. And the potato is a particularly successful example of a food that's traveled really everywhere in the world, taking on utterly new and different meanings as it travels. China is now the world's leading producer and consumer of potatoes. Wow. And they have a completely distinct meaning and significance in China. And if you say to most people potato, they might say Ireland or something like that. So each country has its own relationship with this Andean foodstuff. And as I said, I think that tells us something about hybridity, movement, and the fact that origin, as I said, isn't destiny.
Right, that's amazing. So actually, oranges played a particular role in Spanish politics, according to your last book, Lara. So tell us a little bit more about oranges in Spain. In Spain.
What's that? Sorry?
No, the oranges in Spain.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, an important function of food discourse from the first 2 decades of the regime was to create a taste amongst readers or citizens for indigenous foodstuffs suited to Spain's autarkic political economy, such as oranges and rice. In producing readers or subjects with a taste for local rather than foreign foodstuffs, official food discourse sustained the Franquist biopolitics as individual taste was managed for the well-being of the collective body. Significant was the way in which this discourse produced in readers a belief in Spain's capacity to feed her own people whilst remaining closed off to foreign or to food imports. As Tiago Saravia explains, and I quote, every fascist regime of the interwar period became obsessed for making the national soil feed the national body, unquote. Saravia gives examples from different regimes, writing in the case of Mussolini that the Italian dictator was obsessed with freeing Italy from the slave of the foreign grain, while the Nazis insisted food independence as a necessary condition for both the biological survival of the rice and its political independence. And the Franquist officials had Mussolini's program and reform in mind, as can be evinced from the many references to Italy in the official publication La Alimentación Nacional. Importantly, and through a biopolitical lens, it is possible to view texts about the images of oranges as playing a critical role in upholding Franquist governance. A range of experts, including government authorities, speak authoritatively about oranges, thereby putting into circulation a truth discourse about the Spanish grown fruit. Together, these different government agencies and the food media promote a discourse about food consumption that targets individual behaviour as a solution to Spain's autarkic Spain's food problems. According to this all-encompassing discourse about food, if Spaniards put patriotism before their own individual preferences, the country will be able to remain economically and culturally or culinary free from outside forces. Of interest is the official newspaper Alimentación Nacional's report on a short film titled La Naranja, which ran at the Avenida José Antonio Theatre. The cartoon-style film tells, and I quote, the history of the orange up to its appearance in Spain, unquote. Relevant to the view inherent to Francoist autarky that Spain should be both economically and culturally shut off from the rest of the world is the way in which the article deals with the film's narration of the orange's introduction to Spain at the time of the Arab rule. According to the article, once in Spain, the orange abandons, and I quote, its exoticism, and thanks to our soil and our sun, which gives it new life, unquote, and is quickly embraced as a national treasure. As a fruit that grows prolifically in Spain, the orange symbolizes Spain's capacity to feed her own people. However, in order to maintain the notion inherent also to autarky of Spain as culturally or culinary shut off from the corrupting forces of foreign influence, the article must first free the orange of its exotic and foreign origins. Spain's oranges are also rendered 100% Spanish through references to their ubiquity in Spanish art and literature. Alimentación Nacional reminds readers of the important place of oranges in the literature of Azorín, which sought, as critics have shown, to define an eternal notion of Spanishness. Also mentioned are Joaquín Soraya's description of orange gardens and his typically Spanish landscapes, such as Entre Naranjos, which he painted in 1903 for the well-known Argentine medical doctor José Semprún. Soraya's painting, described as a cheerful picture of a Valencian theme, is important not only for what it says about the bonds of Hispanidad, but also for its idyllic depiction of the cultural lifestyle associated with Spanish oranges. With Azorín and Soraya occupying a place as canonically Spanish in style and content of their work, Alimentación Nacional cast oranges as iconic for their place in the cultural production of two such Spanish grapes. That's just some examples.
Yeah, some of the really interesting ways in which the orange, right, evolves in that cultural context of Spain. I really like that part about, getting rid of this exoticism to become actually a Spanish product. So let's move to another fruit, but also served in very different forms, right? The plantain. Melissa, tell us something about the plantain.
Yeah, no, and actually, as I was hearing Rebecca and Lara speak in my head, I was trying to concoct a recipe where we can combine the three ingredients. And the interesting thing about plantain is that it can be sweet or savory. So we can play with those flavors. But back to the conversation. When you brought up this question, I think for me in my work, plantain took a salience as I was speaking with Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans in New York City. And the way that it, as I was speaking to people, I was also reading through history of how our cuisines came to be. And the plantain, it is a key ingredient of cocinas caribeñas, of our cuisines. And again, back to what Rebecca was saying, it's not originally from the Caribbean, but was brought over as part of slave diets, along with other foods like breadfruit and others. And in this examination, I borrow from Puerto Rican historian Cruz Miguel Ortiz Cuadra. He has this amazing book, Eating Puerto Rico, where a part of it is he recounts the history of all of our foods. And as part of that, he talks about the plantain and how the fruit came to the island and its connection to slavery, and then also later on to poverty. And as he argues, because the plantain was so easy to grow. And even nowadays, a lot of people, if you have a backyard, you might have plantain. And it also came to be known as basic sustenance, and sort of got a stigma as a food consumed by the uncultivated rural population, as he explains it. And then again, you have that stigma, of course, tied to it being part of the diet of slaves, as it provided bulk in the diet, satiety, and some nutrients. But nowadays, if you look at the plantain as a key ingredient, we have it, for example, and I think that there's an image of these. Thank you. That was one of the dishes that I saw. I mean, that one of the foods that really cross across the three cuisines, aside from the rice and the beans. And we have, for example, the Puerto Rican mofongo, the Dominican mango, and plantains, I feel, or according to what people, how Cubans describe their cuisine, is less present in Cuban cuisine, but still you have the mariquitas, which you see a picture there. And I hope people got something to eat, because you might be getting hungry like I am even speaking about this. So it was interesting as I was talking with Caribeños, that one of the questions that I asked them was to how do you differentiate your diet from that of the other Caribeños? Like if I was talking with a Puerto Rican, I would ask, how is Puerto Rican diet different from Cuban and Dominican and so on? And this is what it really struck me, was that plantain was used as a way to differentiate from one another. And for example, Cubans and Puerto Ricans talk about the mango as being a breakfast food, and how, for example, we don't eat that for breakfast. That's very bulky. And then in those conversations, you could see that, that they eat it that way because of they go and work on the field, like they need that sustenance. And in some, you can see like linking poverty to plantain. And even though, of course, that in practice, that might not be necessarily the case. And then also when Cubans, for example, differentiated Puerto Rican cuisine, that was another way that they spoke about it. Oh, you guys, you eat way more plantain. And again, for me, that was one of those times where it was really interesting to see that even within ourselves, how we pointed to the other, and some interesting hierarchies that definitely, even though of course it's not intentional in the way people spoke about food, but I could see or I argue that it is tied to implicit hierarchies that are of course tied to race. And the plantain was, of course, a vehicle for people to talk about that.
That's really interesting how they differentiate between sort of the uses of, how, when you eat it or how you eat the plantain. And you actually did reminded me of mango, and every Dominican that I met loves this dish, and they talk so much about it. And I finally got to try it, and indeed it's really, really good, but perhaps a bit heavy for breakfast. So we talked about food. Let's go back to movement to round up and finish this discussion. So I'd like to invite you again to think about movement, and especially in our present world, and ask you, perhaps, in what ways do you think food, right, in the global Hispanophone and beyond, will and or should change? Perhaps Melissa, can you say something about that? And Lara and Rebecca, and actually, I think Rebecca has a perfect example to show us this idea. Melissa.
Yeah, no, I see in Latin America there is a movement, and of course it's not only Latin America, we see it in other places, the decolonize your diet movement, and it's trying to go back to ideas about what food was before movement. So I see, and that movement, I see it tied to potential healthier ways to configure these cuisines. This movement, for example, argues for more sustainable plant-based diets where we maybe let go of our beloved pork, chorizo, things like that, in favor of more, again, plant-based, potentially healthier diets, even though I see this argument, you know, in places like Mesoamerica, but then we can argue, of course, if native diets were truly vegetarian, where in reality they ate fish, they ate other animals as well. But then I also see that there's again not only in Puerto Rico, but the back to the land, back to knowing where your food comes from. And I see again back to the idea of the movement of ideas that I see this is really trickling to how people view their cuisines. And again, going back to the source, healthier and more sustainable diets, hopefully through that. And I'm very excited to see, for example, innovations that are happening in cuisines that are getting to more sustainable eating, where again, it's not only about nutrition, we also see that connection between what is good for the planet is good for the body. So that, you know, I look forward to just seeing how these changes happen, because even if we don't want to, we'll need to make that change happen at some point.
Thank you. Lara, do you have something to add? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Not much to add about movement, but so I don't have much to add to what Melissa's been talking about in relation to contemporary food trends, which is all really fascinating. I suppose for me, movement's the idea of the circulation of ideas and texts. And so when national cuisines come into existence, people will be quoting or citing like Paraguayan authors will be citing Amelia Pardewathan or other Spanish writers, sort of to make clear that the genealogy of their cuisine dates back to Spain as well, but also to the idea of discourses being, or national cuisines being, textually reliant. So that's a kind of, we see that circulation of that idea or that sense of what it is to talk about a national cuisine. And then during periods of authoritarianism as well, the gendering of food writing and the idea that women write cookery books and not gastronomic texts was also apparent in Paraguay during the Stroessner regime. Oh. And also, so in Spain, this idea during the Franco regime of regional cuisines being kind of subsumed for the purpose of the national cuisine, or that these writers were kind of giving lip service to the idea of regional cuisines rather than properly showcasing or promoting them. That sort of idea is then apparent in the treatment of indigenous cuisines in Paraguay during the Stroessner regime. So just more circulation of ideas, the importance of discourse to national cuisines, the role that women play at any time when it comes to food writing, which isn't, in these kind of examples, isn't as important gastronomic writers. They're writing cookery books.
Thank you. That sounds really fascinating, and we should talk more about that at some point. Rebecca.
Well, I think that, I mean, both what Lara and Melissa have been talking about points to the connections between food and power. I think that's the thing that comes across really strongly. I certainly don't feel it's my role to be, not my role, it would not be appropriate for me to be saying how I think food in the Hispanic world ought to change. I don't think that's for me to say. But I think what's really interesting about the emergence, for example, of the decolonizing the diet initiatives, which have been really interesting and imaginative. And there are people, I mean, there are people in the United States who are working on this, and in Canada as well, on people from First Nations trying to think about that, is it really points to the continuing connections between history and today's world. And so the idea that imperialism or that colonialism is something that lingers on in our diets, I think is really powerful to think about. what that means precisely in terms of how one wants to change the diet is almost a separate question. I mean, the extent to which, I mean, as Melissa was saying, what it would mean to go, what a decolonized diet would look like is a topic. I mean, that's as much a historical question as anything else. And it's the thing that people could argue about. And in some ways, it's an idea and a prompt for action rather than necessarily a call for absolute authenticity about how people ate in the past. I think it's about, encourages us to think critically about how we came to eat the way we do and whether we want to carry on eating that way. And
Rebecca, I think we have an image for you to comment.
Oh, yeah. That's right. That's right. There was. So there was. Yeah, there was. I think this is a wonderful quote. Yeah, this is from Thomas Sankara, who was the president of Burkina Faso in the 1960s, and you can read it yourself. He says it really clearly. I think this idea that colonialism is something that has an impact on our eating habits, and that can be a prompt for us to, as I was saying, to think about whether we want to eat differently and what that might look like. But also just to remind ourselves that eating is always embedded with questions of power. And also, I would say this as a historian, in history. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Melissa, for your brilliant interventions. Lots to think about. We already have questions from our audience. So I think I'm just going to quickly jump right into some of the questions that have been coming my way. And please, if you think that you want to start answering them, that's great. Let me see. Let's see. So can each of the speakers, this is a question that one of our listeners have written to us, can each of those speakers discuss the role of gender in the dialogue between the matter of food and food discourse? And I think Lara already has talked a bit about this. And how do these roles change over time? So I'm thinking of examples like the male cooking clubs in the Basque Country, the Chocos, or the emergence of celebrity chefs like Jose Andres. And how do these articulations of gender and food relate to everyday practices that may or may not be differentiated by gender? And there is a secondary observation in that question. It would be that in that relation that some chefs like Andres have forged between fame and philanthropy and food justice, like with Andres' World Central Kitchen. So would any of you like to tackle that question about gender?
I can attempt that.
Sure.
I mean, I know in food studies, there is a wealth of literature examining exactly that, who gets to be star chef, and how is it that even though we women tend to be the ones expected to be in the kitchen, men are the ones that are then featured in all of these portraits and star chefs and all of that. And we can of course talk about that, but I just wanted to mention that, of course, in my conversations for my research, gender was prevalent. And something that I noticed in the conversations was that even though, again, the women, we are still expected to be the ones in charge of cooking in the domestic space, you can see a change growing with the younger generations, where there is a sharing of space, but still the women is still the one expected to. And when I had men that cooked frequently at the home, it was really interesting because, for example, my black beans are the best, or like whatever dish they do, it's like spectacular. Whereas when women talk about cooking, it's like, well, it's something that I have to do to feed the family. It's nothing like an event as when the men cook. So I think that even though, again, I thought it was interesting that the men were more in the kitchen, there was still like this level of celebration, like, oh, look, I'm in the kitchen.
That's really interesting, and it's actually true. I think that I share the same experiences as you. Lara, Rebecca, would you like to add something about gender?
Well, I'll say just very briefly to sort of, I mean, Melissa was just talking about her observations about the present. I'll say a few words about the past, which is to remember that these foods, for example, from the Americas that entered diets all over the world, they don't prepare themselves, and they travel with expertise. And so the knowledge of how you prepare foods is part of, let's say, an assemblage of ideas and concepts and things that travel. Sometimes they travel together, sometimes the food loses that expertise, so that when maize traveled around the world outside of Mesoamerica, it lost the processing techniques, the so-called nixtamalization, which was what produces the distinctive flavor of corn tortillas and tamales, etc. And so maize, when it traveled around the world, it lost what was really a feminine expertise that was crucial to the cuisines of Mesoamerica. Other times the foods traveled with that expertise, and often it was because of the movement of women as well. So women were often the people who were the guardians of that knowledge for how you prepare food. And so we should think about that, not just that these foods as kind of footloose agents that are going off all over the world on their, on their travels without needing any assistance. So we could think about that dimension of the food movements as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very good. Lara?
Yeah, those are great answers. So I'm thinking about gender in relation to the past as well, and the Franco regime, and just thinking about the regimes, what has been described as the regime's kind of unprecedented control of the female body. So one of the things I look at in one of my the chapter on gender is the use of or how official cookery books directed at women function to create compliant subjectivities, or to demand obedience from women in relation to the cookery instruction, and then kind of the extending that to the house and the state, so their role in relation to men and as citizens. And it's the absence of narrative. So some scholars talk about women's cookery books have narrative, and that functions to create relationships and the sense of women sharing cooking, and it being something that they do together, and it's an expertise that they draw on and is passed down from one generation to the next. But these cookery books, the official Francoist cookery books directed at women, don't have any of that narrative, and they completely ignore any of women's past cooking experience by creating this idea of culinary modernity. And so women are completely dependent on the sección femenina, which was representative for the Francoist state, in learning to cook, and there's no idea of them belonging to this community of cooks, and as cooking being something that women instinctively do often because they have done it, and they learn it from their mothers and grandmothers informally, and all of that was just erased in these cookery books, and they're very austere, narrative-free cookery books that controlled the female body in a way that the male body wasn't controlled.
Great. We have one more question, actually. I think this might be, I have this feeling this might be for Melissa. So we have a common question from Junior C. Hawkins, and says, interesting that Cubans would say that I'm Cuban and fried ripe plantains are such an integral part of Cuban cuisine, as are the tostones. We also have an equivalent of mofongo. We call it fufu, though it is not the same dish as the West African diet by the same name. I think this is more of a comment, but definitely speaks to the different ways plantain is consumed in the Caribbean. Melissa, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I just I agree, and thank you for bringing that up, Janaisi. And just to clarify, I agree, and people, of course, they brought up the fried plantain de maduro, or we call them amarillos in Puerto Rico. So that's, I think, why it was also so interesting as to how they use plantain to say, like, oh yeah, we eat that, but they eat it more. So it wasn't a statement saying we don't eat plantains, because I agree. I lived in Miami and I lived on Cuban restaurants offering the tostones and the maduros. I wouldn't have survived without that. But it was more of that othering, like, oh yeah, we eat it, but you eat it more. That was so interesting in the conversations.
Thank you. I think that we have unfortunately run out of time. So I'm going to close this roundtable. Thank you so much again to our presenters today. Thank you to our audience, and most importantly, thank you to the King Juan Carlos I Center, and congratulations on their 25th anniversary. And I look forward to listening to the other wonderful programming they have to celebrate the occasion of their anniversary. Thank you so much, and good afternoon.
Thank you.